They didn't die on battlefields. They didn't carry weapons. Yet thousands of nuns vanished as the Ottoman Empire expanded. Convents emptied, records erased, lives swallowed by silence. So here's the question historians still struggle to answer. What really happened to the nuns who stood in the path of one of history's most powerful empires? We uncover the history books that were hidden for centuries. Subscribe to join our quest for the truth. History loves generals, emperors, and conquests. It remembers the men who ruled, the wars that reshaped continents, and the dates that defined eras. But history often forgets the quiet lives, the ones that left no monuments behind. As the Ottoman Empire rose from a small frontier state into a world-spanning power, it absorbed vast Christian lands across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Churches were transformed, cities renamed, and societies reshaped. Yet hidden behind those massive changes is a question rarely asked. What happened to the women who lived behind monastery walls, the nuns who had sworn vows of faith, service, and silence long before Ottoman soldiers ever arrived? Some accounts say they were protected. Others hint at forced conversions, captivity, and quiet disappearance. Official records speak of tolerance, but scattered testimonies tell a darker, more complicated story. This is not a story of simple villains or heroes. It's a historical investigation into lost voices, women whose lives rarely mattered to those who wrote history. Tonight, we are uncovering what documents avoid, what silence conceals, and what fragments still remain. This is the dark truth behind the fate of Ottoman nuns. Who were the nuns before Ottoman expansion? Long before the Ottoman Empire rose to power, long before its banners appeared on the horizons of Christian lands, thousands of women lived lives devoted to faith, discipline, and service. These women were nuns, and they were far more than silent figures hidden behind monastery walls. Across the Byzantine Empire, the Balkans, Greece, Armenia, and parts of Anatolia, convents were deeply woven into everyday life. They were not isolated places. They were respected institutions, protected by church law, local rulers, and long-standing tradition. For many women, becoming a nun was not an escape from the world, but a way to shape it. In an era when marriage often meant total dependence on a husband, convents offered something rare: stability, education, and purpose. Nuns learned to read and write at a time when most women could not. They preserved religious manuscripts, copied ancient texts, and safeguarded knowledge that stretched back to Roman and early Christian times. Many convents operated schools for girls, teaching literacy, music, and religious study. Others ran hospitals and infirmaries, caring for the sick during plagues and wars. Some provided food and shelter for the poor, widows, and orphaned children. These women were caregivers, teachers, and administrators, and importantly, they were legally recognized. Under Byzantine and later Christian rule, convents owned land. They received donations from nobles and emperors. They were protected by law from interference. To violate a convent, to harm a nun, was not just a moral crime, but a legal one. Nuns were not powerless. They answered to abbesses, not husbands. Their loyalty was to God and their community, not to a household. In many regions, convents were among the few spaces where women exercised real authority. This is critical to understand, because when the Ottoman Empire expanded into these lands, it did not simply conquer territory, it encountered a deeply rooted religious and social system where nuns held a respected place. And that made what happened next far more complicated. Ottoman expansion into Christian territories. The rise of the Ottoman Empire was fast, relentless, and transformative. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Ottomans began as a small frontier state. Within a few generations, they became one of the most powerful empires in the world. Their expansion swept through Anatolia, crossed into Europe, and reshaped the Balkans forever. City by city, kingdom by kingdom, Christian lands fell under Ottoman control. The most symbolic moment came in 1453, when Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity, was captured. The fall of the city sent shockwaves across Europe. It was not just a military defeat, it marked the end of an era. With conquest came transformation. Churches were converted into mosques. Christian elites lost political power. Entire communities found themselves living under a new Islamic empire that spoke a different language, followed different laws, and answered to a different faith. For monasteries and convents, this moment was deeply uncertain. Some religious institutions were allowed to continue operating. Others were closed, absorbed, or abandoned. In certain regions, convents disappeared almost overnight. In others, they lingered for decades before fading from records. Officially, the Ottomans did not declare war on Christianity. Instead, they introduced a system that claimed to protect religious minorities, while also placing them firmly under imperial control. And for nuns, this distinction would prove crucial. Because conquest on paper and conquest in reality were very different things. Armies moved fast, sieges were brutal, towns changed hands multiple times. During these moments of chaos, women, especially those living in isolated convents, were among the most vulnerable. Some fled before the Ottomans arrived. Others were trapped behind walls that offered little protection against soldiers. Many convents were located outside major cities, far from imperial oversight. And once the fighting ended, the question remained: would the new empire allow these women to continue their way of life, or would their world quietly disappear? The answer lay in a system that sounded tolerant but carried hidden consequences. The millet system: protection or control? To understand what happened to Ottoman nuns, we must understand the system that governed religious life under the empire. It was called the millet system. On the surface, it appeared progressive for its time. The Ottomans allowed Christians and Jews to practice their religion. Churches were permitted. Religious leaders were recognized. Communities could govern themselves in certain matters, like marriage, education, and worship. To many historians, this is cited as evidence of Ottoman tolerance. But tolerance came with conditions. Non-Muslims were classified as dhimmis, protected but unequal. They paid special taxes. They had fewer legal rights. Their testimony in court often carried less weight than that of Muslims. And for women religious, nuns, this created a dangerous gray zone. The millet system recognized churches and male clergy. Bishops, priests, and patriarchs were official representatives of Christian communities. But nuns? They were rarely mentioned. Convents had no direct political voice. Abbesses did not negotiate with Ottoman officials. When disputes arose over land, property, or protection, convents often depended on male church leaders, who were themselves under pressure. Over time, many convents lost their land through legal manipulation or taxation. Some were quietly absorbed into the Ottoman system. Others were abandoned because they could no longer support themselves. And in moments of instability, rebellions, wars, local uprisings, the protections of the millet system often collapsed entirely. Local authorities did not always follow imperial law. Soldiers did not always respect religious boundaries, and nuns living far from power centers were easy to ignore. The empire claimed protection, but protection did not always mean safety. And as records grew thinner, as convents vanished from documents, a troubling question emerged. Were these women protected, or were they simply erased, slowly, silently, and without witnesses? That question leads us deeper into the darkness of this history. Disappearing convents and silenced records. If you follow the trail of history far enough, you eventually reach a wall of silence. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, something strange appears in the historical record across Ottoman-controlled Christian lands. Convents that once stood for centuries suddenly stop appearing in tax documents, church registries, and local accounts. Some vanish abruptly. Others fade slowly, mentioned less and less, until they are gone. No grand announcements, no official decrees saying this convent is closed, just absence. Historians studying the Balkans, Greece, and Anatolia have noticed this pattern again and again. A convent is recorded as active under Byzantine or early Christian rule. Then, after Ottoman conquest, references become rare. Eventually, they disappear entirely. What happened? In some cases, buildings were repurposed. A convent might be converted into housing, storage, or absorbed into a nearby mosque complex. In other cases, the land was confiscated due to unpaid taxes. Under Ottoman law, religious institutions that could not meet financial obligations could lose their property. But records rarely mention the women themselves. There are no lists of nuns being relocated, no clear statements of protection or expulsion, just silence. This is where history becomes uncomfortable, because silence is not neutral. Women, especially religious women, were often excluded from official documentation. Male clergy were recorded, male leaders negotiated, male lives were counted, but nuns lived outside the systems that produced paperwork. When a convent disappeared, no one was required to explain where its residents went. Some nuns fled before Ottoman forces arrived, traveling west into territories still under Christian control. Others likely returned to family life if they could, but many had no families left. Some had entered convents as children. Others had nowhere to go. And for those caught during sieges or sudden invasions, escape may not have been an option. This is where darker possibilities emerge. Because in wartime, records are not just lost, they are never written. Forced conversions, captivity, and assimilation. Official Ottoman law forbade the forced conversion of Christians, but history is shaped not only by laws, it is shaped by reality. During military campaigns, sieges, and local conflicts, law often collapsed. Cities were looted, villages were burned, and women, regardless of faith, were among the most vulnerable. Surviving accounts from European travelers, diplomats, and church officials describe a troubling pattern during periods of instability. Religious women, especially those living outside major cities, were sometimes captured during warfare. Their status as nuns offered little protection once armies breached convent walls. Some were taken as captives. In the Ottoman world, captives were often absorbed into society. Women might be sold into households, placed into servitude, or forced into marriages after conversion to Islam. Once converted, voluntarily or under pressure, they disappeared from Christian history forever. This was not always systematic. It varied by region, commander, and circumstance, but it happened often enough to leave traces, fragments of letters, desperate appeals, and rumors recorded by church authorities far from Ottoman lands. There are mentions of holy women taken, of convents emptied by war, of sisters lost to the east. Once a nun was forced to convert, her previous identity vanished. She became Ottoman, Muslim, invisible to Christian history. And even when conversion was not forced outright, pressure was constant. Christian communities faced higher taxes. Convents struggled financially. Without male protectors or political influence, some nuns may have converted simply to survive, to gain food, shelter, or safety. This was not mass violence in the dramatic sense. It was slow erasure. Assimilation does not leave mass graves. It leaves empty pages. The devshirme system and female captivity. When discussing Ottoman policies toward Christians, one system is often mentioned, the devshirme. This was the practice of taking Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and training them for service in the Ottoman state. It is well documented, it is debated, and it is often used as evidence of both oppression and opportunity. But what is rarely discussed is the shadow of this system. Because while devshirme officially targeted boys, wars and conquests created a parallel reality for women. During campaigns, entire communities were displaced, families were broken apart, and in that chaos, women, especially those without male protectors, were frequently taken as captives. Nuns fell into this category. They lived communally. They had no husbands, no sons to defend them, and once their convents fell, they had no recognized political guardian within the Ottoman system. Captured women were often redistributed into Ottoman households. Some entered domestic service. Others were forced into marriages after conversion. Over time, their previous identities were erased, not by decree, but by daily life. A former nun could become a wife, a servant, a mother, her past unrecorded, her faith forgotten by history. This is what makes their fate so difficult to trace. They were not executed en masse. They were absorbed. And absorption is the most effective form of disappearance. By the time later historians searched for these women, there was nothing left to find. No convents, no records, no descendants who remembered their former lives. Only silence. And that silence forces us to confront a painful truth. Not all historical tragedies are loud. Some are quiet, and some are forgotten on purpose. Stories that survived, rare testimonies. When history falls silent, truth survives only in fragments. For centuries, scholars believed the fate of Ottoman-era nuns was simply unknowable. Too few records, too many gaps, too much time. But scattered across Europe and the Middle East, a handful of voices remained, faint, incomplete, and often ignored. These voices come from letters, from travelers, from church officials writing in desperation, from foreign diplomats who witnessed what local records refused to record. In archives outside Ottoman control, Rome, Venice, Vienna, and parts of Eastern Europe, historians have uncovered brief but haunting references, mentions of convents no longer standing, of sisters taken during the wars, of holy women who vanished without trace. One letter, written by a Christian cleric in the late 15th century, speaks of a convent near a captured city that stood empty after the siege, its women neither buried nor found. Another account from a European traveler describes meeting Christian women in Ottoman households who spoke of a former life in service to God. These are not detailed confessions, they are whispers, and they were dangerous whispers. Church authorities were cautious about what they recorded. Accusing the Ottoman state directly could provoke retaliation against remaining Christian communities. Many reports were deliberately vague, coded language used to describe captivity, conversion, or disappearance without naming those responsible. Even survivors rarely spoke openly. A former nun who converted, willingly or not, risked punishment or exile if she tried to return to Christian life. Many had children. Many had no path back. Silence became survival. So historians must read between the lines. A missing convent here, a sudden drop in female monastic populations there, repeated references to lost sisters with no explanation. Each fragment alone proves little. Together, they reveal a pattern, not of a single violent policy, but of repeated, quiet destruction. Was it systematic or situational? This is the most difficult question and the most important one. Did the Ottoman Empire deliberately target nuns? The honest answer is no. There is no evidence of an empire-wide policy ordering the persecution of nuns or the destruction of convents. Ottoman law officially protected religious minorities. Forced conversion was forbidden. In theory, nuns should have been safe. But history does not operate in theory. What emerges instead is something more complex and more troubling. The fate of nuns depended heavily on where they lived and when conquest occurred. In stable regions under strong central control, some convents survived for decades. A few even continued operating under Ottoman rule, though often reduced in size and influence. But in frontier zones, areas of frequent war, rebellion, or weak governance, protections collapsed. Local officials ignored imperial law. Soldiers acted without restraint. Convents were viewed not as sacred spaces, but as undefended property. And gender made everything worse. Male clergy had political value. They represented communities. They negotiated taxes. They maintained order. Nuns did none of that. They had no strategic importance, which made them expendable. So while there was no master plan, there was a consistent outcome. Wherever instability existed, nuns suffered disproportionately. Their disappearance was not ordered, it was allowed. And sometimes, allowing harm is as powerful as causing it. Why history went silent? So why don't we hear more about this? Why are these stories absent from textbooks, documentaries, and mainstream history? The answer lies in who writes history and who it serves. First, history has long been written by men. Wars, treaties, rulers, and revolutions dominate the narrative. The experiences of women, especially religious women, were considered secondary, even irrelevant. Second, political sensitivity played a role. For Christian historians, emphasizing persecution risked exaggeration and propaganda. For Ottoman historians, acknowledging abuses threatened the empire's image of tolerance. So both sides avoided the subject. And third, silence was convenient. Nuns left no descendants to demand remembrance. Their communities were dissolved, their buildings repurposed, their lives left behind no monuments. When no one remembers you, you disappear twice. once in life and once in history. But silence does not mean innocence. It means neglect. And when we finally listen to fragments, to gaps, to unanswered questions, we begin to understand that the story of Ottoman nuns is not just about the past. It is about how easily entire lives can be erased when they do not fit the narrative of power. Modern historical debate: truth, myth, and memory. Today, historians approach the fate of Ottoman-era nuns with caution, and for good reason. This subject sits at the crossroads of religion, empire, nationalism, and gender, areas where facts are often distorted by emotion and ideology. Modern scholars are divided, not because the evidence is weak, but because it is incomplete. Some historians emphasize Ottoman legal frameworks. They point to imperial decrees protecting religious minorities, the continued existence of churches, and examples of Christian communities surviving for centuries under Ottoman rule. From this perspective, the disappearance of convents is seen as a result of economic decline, migration, or voluntary adaptation rather than persecution. Others argue that focusing only on law misses the lived reality. They highlight regional instability, wartime violence, and the structural vulnerability of women's religious communities. These scholars argue that while the empire did not officially target nuns, it consistently failed to protect them, especially in frontier zones where imperial oversight was weak. Both perspectives contain truth. The Ottoman Empire was not a single uniform machine. It was vast, diverse, and inconsistent. Conditions in one province could differ dramatically from those in another. A convent might survive peacefully in one region, while another disappeared entirely just a few miles away. What modern historians increasingly agree on, however, is this: the absence of evidence does not mean the absence of suffering. The lack of mass executions or written orders does not mean lives were unharmed. Instead, it suggests a form of loss that was slow, fragmented, and easy to overlook. And perhaps most importantly, scholars today recognize that gender matters. Women's experiences, especially those outside traditional family structures, were rarely recorded. The silence surrounding nuns is not accidental. It reflects centuries of historical priorities that valued power over vulnerability. As archives continue to open and scholarship evolves, the story of these women is slowly re-emerging, not as a simple tale of cruelty or tolerance, but as a human tragedy shaped by indifference.
They did not leave behind statues. They did not write memoirs. They did not command armies or shape empires. Yet their lives mattered. The nuns who lived in the path of Ottoman expansion were not symbols or footnotes. They were teachers, caregivers, and believers who built communities long before borders changed. Some survived by adapting. Some disappeared through captivity or conversion. Others vanished into history without explanation. Their fate was not sealed by a single decree, but by silence, instability, and neglect. This story challenges the way we think about history. It reminds us that suffering does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through lost records, abandoned buildings, and voices never written down. When we ask what really happened to Ottoman nuns, we are asking a deeper question. Whose stories do we choose to remember? Because every time history forgets the powerless, it risks repeating the same silence. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is not what happened to these women, but how long it took for anyone to ask where they went.